Hello everyone from Ukraine, you're watching Channel 24. My name is Andriy Drozda and our guest today is Mrs. Alla Hurska. She is an analyst at the Jamestown Foundation, associate expert at the International Center for Policy Studies based in Kyiv, and a lecturer at the McEwan University Business School. Mrs. Hurska, so happy to see you at our channel and thank you for joining us today.
Great to be here, thank you.
So from the beginning, I would like to ask you about the economic and security challenges of this war created for all the world around, not only for Ukraine. And besides this threat of famine in Africa and nuclear consensus, what are the main threats that this war created for everyone around the globe?
In order to answer your question, I would like to start with the information that Russia was the world's largest exporter of grains, natural gas, fertilizers, and among the world's largest suppliers of crude oil and metals. Such metals including palladium, platinum, gold, cobalt, nickel, titanium, and aluminium. And Russia also produced about the third of the global palladium supply, and this rare metal is used in very important sensor chips and certain types of computer memory. And also we have to remember that Ukraine, before the war, was an important player on the global food market. Ukraine grows enough food to feed almost 400 million people worldwide, and this included sunflower oil supply and grain supply and wheat supply and so on. So Ukraine was a key producer and exporter of wheat and corn, and it was almost 90% of its wheat export went to Africa and Asia, so the most disadvantaged, I would say, regions of the world. Also, the supply of neon required for chip manufacture was also severely affected by war, because Ukraine produced about 70% of the global neon supply, and the two largest suppliers in Ukraine, which together accounted almost the half of the global neon production, they were closed just after the beginning of the Russian full-scale invasion. And the supply of krypton and xenon, which is also Ukraine is a major exporter of, which were affected as well. The war also restricted supply lines for chemicals, metals, and pushed the price up. Also, apart from this, the Russian war in Ukraine is having an outsized impact on the global supply chain. The immediate effect of the supply chain has been the sharp rise in the prices of commodities, including such commodities as petrol and diesel. Although it is, we have to remember that the Russian war in Ukraine is hardly the only contributing factor to the current global supply chain crisis. First of all, the supply chain disruption started before the war. It was during the trade wars between China and the US in 2019, 2018, and continued during the COVID pandemic. But obviously the war and its consequences have troubled critical logistics and trade route operations. One of the most alarming supply chain issues resulting from the war is obviously food shortages, but particularly serious in low-income countries in Africa. Also, the invasion of Ukraine has had a significant impact on the mobility of people and goods, especially in the EU, across all modes of transport. Among the main issues are fuel supplies and increasing fuel price, as well as logistical challenges linked to, for example, border crossing and airspace restrictions. And finally, China-European routes are another casualty of the Russian invasion. Surging gas prices are increasing transportation costs for all modes of transport, as I mentioned before. The train route connecting the regions, which became highly competitive during the COVID pandemic, especially for such industries as automobile industry and electronics, is now almost stalled. And this is especially true for primarily corridor that crosses Russia, Belarus, and Poland before it continuing its way to Germany and other European countries. And obviously, the full-scale invasion threatened the energy supply from Russia to Europe. But apart from this, this also increased the demand for LNG imports in Europe and has boosted competition for gas around the world. Such countries as Pakistan and Bangladesh, for example, they rely heavily on LNG, but they have less financial leverage in the market and have been hurt by the current situation. And in general, some LNG traditionally have gone to Asia. This year they sailed to Europe. But of course, some Asian nations such as China, Japan, South Korea, they will continue to use a lot of LNG. So they will likely seek significant imports in the colder months. And this potentially fueling competition between countries. The issue about sovereignty, about democracy versus autocracy, human rights, and the global world order, this is another issue that the world faces today. This means that whatever it comes, maybe it could mark a turning point for the world security order, for the world security infrastructure. The current security architecture, as we know it, it was established after the Second World War and could be overthrown right now. This could have an effect on the global economy too. So the world security architecture must be retorn, and the United Nations has to be able to offer meaningful responses, mainly due to the paralysis effect to Russia veto. To sum up, definitely the Russian invasion into Ukraine was, we can say that it was a turning point for world security, the international economy, and global energy architecture. And obviously it will have far-reaching consequences in a variety of areas. And these challenges will not be limited to Ukraine. Due to the globalized world we live in, the war will pose challenges across the globe.
Okay, so my next questions would be about the long-term effect of the sanctions, which is now put on the Russian economy, and it is a very painful, probably, response from the Western countries and from the Western states. What is the chance that Russia can get rid of this consequences of the sanctions after Putin's regime would collapse and Putin would go away? Or it takes time to put away those sanctions and restore the economic potential of Russian state and society?
First of all, since the invasion of Ukraine, the Kremlin has filtered out the most unfavorable economic data and make up publicly only those that are positive. This practice borrowed from the USSR. For example, foreign trade figures are no longer public. So we can just speculate on real present situation in Russia and try to forecast somehow. The international sanctions have penalized entire sectors of the Russian economy and caused major disruption in the automobile and industrial sectors, for example. There have been problems with the logistics as well, and moreover, almost 1,200 foreign companies that left Russia accounted for about 40% of Russian GDP before the war. Also, sanctions notably targets major Russian banks, the Russian Central Bank, for example, the Russian sovereign debt, and selected Russian public officials and oligarchs, and the export control of high-tech components to Russia. These measures put considerable downward pressure on the Russian ruble, and which has already fallen and triggered a spike in consumers' price inflation. Also, Russian, for example, hypersonic ballistic missiles production has nearly ceased due to lack of necessary semiconductors used in the manufacturing process. Russia's military aviation program has been cut off from resupply provided by global aviation trade, and Russian production of its next generation airborne early warning and control military aircraft has stalled due to the lack of foreign components, including semiconductors as well. So mechanical parts, including those producing surface-to-air missiles, have been shut down due to shortages of foreign origin components as well. So Russia has to return to Soviet-era defense stocks because sanctions have interrupted Russian companies' abilities to replace domestic supply chain. And by blocking Russian access to the high components that its military sector needs, sanctions are steadily weakening Russia, obviously. But what it is necessary to take into account that after 2014, Russia steadily transformed its economy, strengthening its autonomy in certain sectors and triggering the development of trade partners outside the sphere of Western countries of Europe and America. And the effect of the sanctions on the Russian economy were thus a little bit more limited than it was expected. Russia has built up relatively strong financials, so a low level of public external debt, recurrent current account surplus, as well as substantial foreign reserves. However, sanctions implemented by, for example, the United States along with allies have immobilized about $300 billion worth of Russian central bank assets, which limiting the central bank's ability to aid the war efforts and mitigate sanctions' impact. So the Russian economy may have resisted so far thanks to, for example, the energy windfall, but it could suffer in the long term. The effects of the sanctions are gradual and cumulative. That is especially the case since not all the measures decided on have yet gone into effect. For example, announced at the end of May by the EU, the massive embargo on Russian oil will not come into effect until early December. And by the end of the year, 90% of exports to the EU will be halted, hopefully. Some economists believe that these sanctions that could be actually the most effective. Oil represents the main source of foreign currency export for Russia, and hopefully the EU countries which actually since February bought oil for more than 50 billion euro worth of oil from Russia. Hopefully they will stop doing this. Moscow will therefore have to turn to third-party partners, but still many believe that Putin, for example, can afford at least 2 more years of war. What we need is definitely more sanctions, more control over their implementation, and consistency. In case of regime change in Russia, my fear is that many of our partners, especially in the EU, will definitely try to whether to lift or to totally cancel those sanctions. And Ukraine has to do everything possible to prevent this.
Got it. And what about China? It looks like China is the huge trade partner of Russia right now after all the sanctions effect from the West. And what is the Chinese position in this war? Do they just keep the distance and wait, or they can be called Russian ally and a friend, or they just serve its own Chinese interests and look how would it go actually till the end?
I would say the Sino-Russian relationship is kind of complicated and in a way paradoxical. Their relationship became simultaneously stronger after the Russian full-scale invasion, but at the same time they became more tense. Russia is definitely more bound to China than it was prior to the invasion. Russia has driven itself further into China's hug, and China obviously see that. China sees Russia's economic difficulties right now and is trying to turn it into its own profits, obviously, for example, on energy import. Also, I think that rather than criticizing Russian war, China is mostly blaming NATO countries and the US. But at the same time, relationships with Russia are causing more and more reputational headaches for China in its relations to the West. So I would say that China right now faces a dilemma. She doesn't want to cut all her relationships with Russia, but at the same time, China wants to maintain her relationships with the West. So she's trying to balance. The longer the war in Ukraine lasts, the more difficult it will be for China to balance. And also, on the one hand, China is more than happy to witness Russia's military difficulties and debunk of its of Russia's military power. On the other hand, the war in Ukraine interrupted Chinese plans. First of all, back in 2014, Russian lawful annexation of Crimea interrupted the development of Chinese projects in Crimea. And further, after February 24th, sanctions on Russia are sidetracking Chinese Silk Road rail corridor, disrupting cargo traffic and creating actually losses for China. While transit via the sanctioned Russian railway is still technically possible, a growing number of logistics companies have effectively halted Belt and Road related operations through Russia. So not only the war starting to cause Beijing loss of trade revenue, it is also turning its infrastructure investment into nothing. Also, for example, China was a big recipient of Ukrainian corn, and in fact, Ukraine replaced the US as China's top corn suppliers in 2021. So China is right now in a hurry and taking steps to accelerate imports of Brazilian corn right now. And Beijing will temporarily even waive a key clause which paves the way for Brazil to ship corn to China. Plus, China has its own plans on the Arctic and the Northern Sea route. And now these plans may also be influenced by the war and sanctions against Russia. Moreover, the economic problems are relatively minor when compared to the social, economic, and geopolitical headache that Russia's war is creating for China. War-induced destabilization, for example, in Kazakhstan and Central Asian states, also is fast emerging source of concerns for China. Russia, on the other hand, is cautious of growing Chinese influence in this region. Also, for example, China wants to limit India's influence in the region, and Russia wants to maintain its partnership relations with India. So there are different aspects of this dilemma for China, but what is definitely true, China never named Russia as an ally state. Rather, it prefers to name Russia as a partner, but not an ally. And I would agree with some experts on Sino-Russian relations that the main force pushing these two countries together is their shared perception that the United States threatened their interest.
Got it. My next question would be about the political decision-making. Ukrainian political elites insist that Russia should be recognized as the the sponsor of terrorism state, and this process has been started. Some European parliaments like Estonian parliament had already recognized Russia as a sponsor of terrorism, and European Parliament would be voting for this in November. How high are the chances that Canada and mainly the United States of America would join this position?
I know that there is a very strong pressure to designate Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism in the US right now, but it's really hard to predict how the things will going on. The first problem with this is that there is no single international checklist of the criteria for determining whether a state's action qualify for being designated as a state sponsor of terrorism. Moreover, Russia's crime in Ukraine far exceeded simply sponsoring terrorism, since the main perpetrator of these terrorist acts is the Russian armed forces, so a core institution of the Russian state. This is not a non-state actor, right? Plus, each country has its own complicated decision-making process and its own complicated way of designation of the state's sponsor of terrorism. Currently, the US has designated 4 countries as state sponsor of terrorism. This is North Korea, Syria, Iran, and Cuba. Canada also has a so-called SST mechanism and has designated Iran and Syria state sponsors of terrorism. Through its actions in the war against Ukraine, Russia has definitely met or even exceeded any reasonable legal or policy-based for designation as a state of sponsor of terrorism with respect to other nations and entities currently holding this designation, right? But why there are some difficulties? First of all, if the United States designates Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism, it will become illegal for U.S. persons and U.S. entities to engage in any financial transactions with the government of Russia. And SST designation would restrict also foreign assistance from the United States or from any organization in which the U.S. is a member. And it will ban all arms-related, for example, exports and sales, strengthen even further the controls over export, re-export, and transfer of dual-use items. And it will put in place additional financial restrictions as well. And this designation would make it easier and more likely for the U.S. to impose secondary sanctions on third parties transactions with the Russian state and private sector entities. And here lies the complexity. For example, Russia is the main exporter of fertilizers to the US. And according to some sources, for example, in the middle of the summer, the US government is quietly encourage agricultural and shipping companies to buy and carry more Russian fertilizers in order to prevent food crisis. So by designating Russia as SST, they would enable their companies and also their partners from doing this. And the same thing with titanium, for example, and other important metals and chemicals. So to sum up, despite the fact that it would be extremely difficult, if possible at all, I still believe that the U.S. Secretary of State should designate the Russian Federation as a state sponsor of terrorism. The government of Canada should make a similar designation, and I can assure you that in a case if US do this, the Canada will follow this example. Other countries in the sanction coalition as well as the European Union, they do not have formal designation of state sponsors of terrorism, actually. That is why they are doing this on state-to-state basis. However, these countries should issue, for example, declarations or pass resolutions stating the same about Russia's terrorist methods, and then implement a new round of sanctions.
Now, then probably our final question would be about the Western response to the Moscow gas blackmailing. Moscow used its economic tools to tie up Germany and other European countries and then intimidate them. I mean, gas pipelines and huge energy crisis that we have now in Europe and in the Western countries. How effectively those Western countries respond to that threat, and are they prepared well for this winter without Russian gas?
The short answer is yes, they are well prepared. European nations started to very actively buy gas over the summer, and the main aim of this was to fill onshore storage tanks with the gas. This was to ensure that it would be enough gas to cover energy needs during the whole winter period. And the original target of the EU was to fill storage facilities up to 80% of their total capacity by November. Right now, we can claim that the target has been met and even exceeded, far ahead of the schedule, by the way. The latest data suggests that storage is now at nearly 95% in total, and imported LNG has played a key role in getting Europe to this point. Also, it is important to take into consideration the fact that that less gas is getting used up in Europe right now due to the very mild weather. Plus, there is a reduction in industrial activities, specifically, as I mentioned before, industrial activities that rely on gas. For example, reduction in cement and steel production, as well as automobiles. As a result, less and less gas is used. So, yes, it would be safe to suggest that European nations are in the best possible position that they could be in, given the overall situation. Also, with the gas secured, the commodity prices in Europe, they steadily has begun to fall as well, and gas prices in Europe have fallen dramatically since August. And in October, gas prices continue to decline, reaching to the lowest point in the last 3 months. So the EU will definitely survive this winter. And the main mystery and the main concerns they have, this is all about the future. What happens tomorrow depends on many different things, on how the war in Europe go, the weather, the rise of renewables, global demand for gas, and so on. So uncertainty of energy supply, that's the thing that scares the EU the most. And probably the diversification of energy supply in Europe should ease things in the coming years also.
Got it. So in the short term, the weather is on our side, but in the long term, the future is unclear. Mrs. Hurska, thank you so much for this conversation, for your answers. It was a tremendous and extremely interesting experience for me. Thank you once more for this dialogue.
Thank you.
And thank you, our dear audience. We hope to see you soon on our channel with our new guests.